Hello everyone, welcome to our final lesson on the human heart. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get this one through. This lecture is going to specifically focus on human blood, all right? And there are two main breakdowns of blood. We have our cellular components and we have our acellular components, okay? Our cellular components are broken up a little bit further into groups of cells. We have red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And as we'll talk about in this lecture, each of these particular types of cells has a specific job that is incredibly important for you to be able to live. All right. And finally, we also have the acellular portion of your blood. That is the more liquid portion. It's like 98% water of this portion of the blood. So 98% of this portion, this plasma, is water. Then you have antibodies and a couple other proteins that are floating around to make up the other 2%. So just as a visual here, when blood flows through your body, through your cardiovascular system, it looks primarily like this. Now this is red blood, okay? So it's red because it has the presence of oxygen. So when blood is taken out of your body, it hits air, mixes with air, gets oxygen, becomes red, okay? Now, this is the same vial of blood that this one is, except for one difference. This guy right here has been put through what's called a centrifuge. And a centrifuge is a little machine that you balance. So you have one test tube here, and then you have another test tube 180 degrees from it, and it spins around really fast. And it spins around so fast, causing the more dense portion of a solution, which is what human blood is, into their individual layers. So you can see we have our plasma layer, and that is roughly 55% of our total blood volume, give or take. It also depends on a couple of different things such as altitude, environmental factors, food source, that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, plasma is about 55% of your blood, and then these red blood cells is roughly 45%. Okay? So now you're probably saying, well, if this is 55 and that's 45, what is this guy? Does he actually get a percentage? And the answer is yes. This white blood cell layer / platelet is less than approximately 1% of our total volume of blood. Okay? And let me write that the correct way, 1%. All right, so roughly 1% or so, or less than, is this layer, okay, made up of white blood cells and platelets. 55% is plasma, 45% is red blood cells. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a microscope slide from a light microscope. So this is something that you guys have looked at through the light microscope, specifically during the frog dissection lab, that second day of it. And each one of these guys here are red blood cells. Now red blood cells are known as a separate name, and they are also known as erythrocytes. Okay, red cell. So erythro is red, cytes are cell. So erythrocytes. Okay, so make sure you know that. I think that's a question on your homework. And then we have, so these guys are all red blood cells. You'll notice they do not have a nucleus floating around the middle here, so there is no dark portion like this. Okay, and then we have these guys. These guys are stained so that you can see them. And these are all different kinds of white blood cells. Okay, so the bigger white with the blue staining are white blood cells. Now you can see that this guy, number 1, doesn't look really much anything like number 2 or number 3. And that's because there are multiple kinds of white blood cells, and they all have specific jobs. Now we're not going to talk about too much about white blood cells beyond their overall main function. That's beyond the scope of our lessons. But they are very detailed, very specific for fighting off immunodeficiency and diseases and stuff like that. These little guys here, let me erase some of this stuff. Okay, these little guys here are called platelets. Okay, and platelets are important because of blood clotting, and we'll talk more about platelets in just a second. First, let's talk about red blood cells. Again, they are anucleate, which means without nucleus. They are biconcave, which means they have 2 concaves, or they bend in towards the middle portion of the cell. So they kind of bow in from either angle. That creates a little dimple, if you will, in the middle of that red blood cell. It is approximately, again, 45% of the total volume of blood. Their job, their one and only job, is to carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. I would know this. This is pretty important since it's the only main function of a red blood cell. Okay? It is filled with a protein called hemoglobin. On the next slide, I'll show you more about hemoglobin itself. And we have a couple of diseases here. Anemia, which is specifically a lack of red blood cells, and it's often caused by a deficiency in the amount of iron that you are getting in your diet. And basically, when you don't have iron, you can't make hemoglobin. No hemoglobin, no red blood cells. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then we have a specific kind of anemia called a sickle cell anemia, and the blood cells are incorrectly shaped. So instead of that nice round shape, they actually have a sickle shape, or like be a crescent shape. All right, you'll see an image of that in a little bit. So this is an electron microscope picture of a red blood cell. You can see how both ends of it kind of concave in. That's where we get the biconcave nature of a red blood cell. And this is a zoomed in picture. So here's the full red blood cell over here. And then zoomed in, we are looking at just a molecule of hemoglobin. And hemoglobins are somewhat kind of sort of related to the same structure, and only structure, similar structure to like what we talked about in DNA. All right, that is the only thing. They're not related to each other. Like I said, red blood cells don't even have nucleus, which is where DNA is stored. It just refers to shape. Okay, so we have 2 alpha chains and we have 2 beta chains. So there are the 2 alpha chain, beta chain, and beta chain. So we have 4 different chains, if you will, that make up this molecule of hemoglobin, and they are stuck together with these iron atoms. So literally an atom of iron. Okay, so that is the chemical symbol of iron. Without iron, we can't get these hemoglobins to stick together. That's bad. When they can't stick together, they can't form a red blood cell. No red blood cells, no carriers of oxygen and carbon dioxide. If you can't get oxygen to the cells, you can't make ATP. Your cells die, you die. Okay? There is a helical shape of the polypeptide molecule. So inside here, it's sort of just like the double helix you saw with a DNA molecule, where if you stretch it all the way out into its loose chromatin, it's like a straight ladder. But when you let it go, it kind of winds on itself into a double helix, and then it sort of clumps on until we get a chromosome. And this is the same type of process in structure only that happens with this hemoglobin. And it just so happens that both hemoglobin and DNA are primarily made up of things called proteins. Other blood cells, we have the white blood cells. They are called leukocytes. Leuko meaning white, and cytes meaning cells. Remember, red blood cells were erythrocytes. So erythro is red, leuko is white. And that is, they are in charge of your immunity and infection defense. So these guys take out the bad stuff that gets in your body. There are many, many different types, as you saw on the light microscope slide that I showed a bit ago. And platelets' main function, which again were those tiny little ones, again in that one slide that I showed with the light microscope. They are really tiny, and they are for blood clotting. So some blood disorders, we have hemophilia. These guys, this is a genetic disorder. You are born with it. You cannot catch it in any way. It is found on the X chromosome. So we all have the possibility of being a hemophiliac because we all have at least one X chromosome. And the problem with hemophilia, or what it is it causes the inability of blood to clot, which means if you get a little cut, which may be harmless to myself, which is not a hemophiliac, someone who suffers from hemophilia could bleed to death. Literally, a bloody nose could cause them to die. Okay, so that's a pretty bad disorder. Then we have anemia, and that just means too few red blood cells. Again, that's due to a loss of iron. Something's wrong with their hemoglobin beyond the loss of iron. There are not enough cells in general, or a combination of all three. Then you have your sickle cell anemia, and this is a picture, an electron diagram, or electron microscope, image of a sickle cell. This is a normal red blood cell. And then you have leukemia. Now, if you look, leukemia and leukocytes all start with the same prefix, right? That leuko or leuke, and again, that means white. So leukemia means you have a problem with your white blood cells. Specifically, you just have too many of them. So it is a form of cancer, but it is not a tumorous form of cancer. It is what we would call a blood cancer. Pretty simple to figure out. All right, and that just means they have too many red white blood cells, and that means that their white blood cells are not doing the job. They're not fighting off diseases. They're off doing things they shouldn't. They're multiplying at an unstoppable rate, which is bad, obviously. Okay? I believe that is it for our lesson. So your video secret number is going to be the number 88. Video secret number is 88, and you have questions to answer, and I will see you in class. Bye, guys.